But Miguel, Ngannou signed with PFL. I mean, let's not bury the lead here on that one. And where he had talks with ONE FC a week ago, and you and I talked extensively about that. Um, there were some things in this contract that he had asked for that we weren't sure he would be given, and boxing being one of them. Since we're talking about boxing today and the crossover, again, Conor McGregor's sponsoring the Katie Taylor fight, MMA boxing crossover. Here we are. Ngannou signs with PFL, but he's a free agent when it comes to boxing, so he can continue with Tyson Fury and other folks. Kind of a big deal here, Miguel.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a, you know, elephant in the room that's been, waiting. People have been waiting to see what Ngannou's going to do for a long time, and now that we have something very definitive, we can move on, especially with, we'll see the UFC. John Jones, tends to be a big entity, so he'll probably be on Twitter, taking shots at Ngannou and this, that, and the other thing.
I've already seen it. I've already
And I
seen
think
it.
that'll continue, but I think that we're now at least a few years away from ever seeing that fight.
Right. Yeah.
So that's something that we have to rule out. Whereas before, there was even the conversation, of Ngannou maybe having to come back to the UFC and bend the knee, and that's not happening. And
because it's what, a 5-fight deal,
I
I
saw
think.
two fights at 20 million, 10 million apiece.
Okay, two. Okay.
Some bells and whistles in there. I don't think they mean much. I think it lends itself to the treatment that they're going to give him. I think Ngannou, you know, deserves to be treated well. He wants to be treated well, and this is
Mm-hmm.
part of that. But I don't think PFL Africa, is
Right.
that big of a carrot right
Right.
now. You know what I
Right.
mean?
I will say though that even even his opponents will make $2 million. Think of what people are making in the UFC.
Yeah,
not many headliners make 2 million.
yeah. You could see what 2 million, looks like compared to the last couple of guys that fought Ngannou in the UFC. So Ngannou, whatever. Those guys didn't make that kind of money, so that's interesting. But I know what Dana's response. First of all, I don't think that the UFC is overly concerned. I'll explain to you why. But I think behind the scenes, what Dana is saying is he'll refer to Don Davis as the PFL's, financier and the chief guy over there. And he goes, it's just another billionaire that wants to lose all his money.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And he's putting together a puzzle. You give these guys credit. These guys operate at a different level. You know what I mean? So I'm not knocking Don Davis, um, for his effort, but it is just that he's been around since 2017. He saw it as an opportunity maybe to take on the UFC as pre and then Endeavor, and he's still investing money, going through rounds of picking up investment and things like that. So in some ways, taking it seriously, but I don't think that he's worrying the UFC even with Ngannou on board.
I think there's an element of a smaller company trying to make a splash, and they might not be a viable and sustainable model, but there's a marketing element to it, is what I'm saying. Think of Live Golf. Live Golf is massively over. Justin Thomas and Phil Mickelson. I mean, those two just I read today are in the top 10 highest paid athletes in the world all of a sudden. Phil Mickelson. Come on. It's because of that Live Golf money, but they're promoting the league and they're trying, and so it's the same way you can go back and look at boxing. Black Prime paying 10 million for Terrence Crawford and whatnot. Well, they've got the videos on the side and you can be a subscriber, and let's face it, 30-second commercial on the Super Bowl is $7 million. So they barely paid more than a 30-second commercial, and people talked about the fight for a month and watched it, and they recouped some of that money. They didn't blow the whole 10. So, but yes, they're overpaying, and so is Live Golf, and sounds like so is PFL. But when there's a marketing element to it, and you're trying to get something back, heck, even Elon Musk overpaid for Twitter. I don't know if that's going to be successful or not at 44 billion. But
Yeah,
my point of
here,
it is these guys have some money sitting around. It's not the end of the world for
and
10
they're
million for
enacting
Crawford.
some type of plan. They've got some type of global
That's it.
approach. They've
That's it.
got, some type of a season, where you do a regular season, then there's like a playoffs, and then like a championship and stuff.
Right. Yeah.
That's, we've seen the IFL. We've seen people attempt versions of that and stuff like that. It's an individual sport. It doesn't work that way. You've got the models of amateur wrestling or anything like that. Even pro wrestling, if you got the old pro wrestling magazines, they all gave you top tens and rankings and things like that. The UFC already has the model down. They don't. The seasonal stuff is the big the big bugaboo that will make them be weaker completely.
And you
Let
can't
me let
plan for
me let me
injuries
elaborate.
either.
Let me
Yeah.
elaborate one other touch.
Yeah.
So you go back to the UFC, and the UFC goes through the process. This is under Zuffa of getting approved by the boxing commissions, and
Right.
then at the same time they've been working over on the side here a deal with this upstart new TV station or cable station called Spike.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Spike takes the jump to put the TV show on, and UFC's 40 million in the hole there. They get to the finals, and you've got Bonner and Forrest Griffin, which is this all-time fight that everybody talks about. And even the UFC people in the rhetoric they point to that fight and say that's the fight that made the UFC. So let's say Ngannou versus whichever one of the average heavyweights PFL have on their roster, because between them and I guess Ryan Bader, if they purchase Bellator, might be a compelling fight in some way, shape, or form. Bader's very small.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure, if Ngannou and Bader is that, but it's a steep fall in name recognition on everybody in Bellator. They haven't even bought Bellator yet. I think
Right.
that might be a next step. That's looking more and more like he's taking steps. Don Davis is taking steps to, enact something big. So he's trying. But let me go back. So Ngannou versus whoever now becomes your Bonner moment, your Bonner Forrest Griffin moment that everybody watches, right?
Mm-hmm.
What people forget is that the UFC had Chuck Liddell versus Randy Couture the next weekend, not a month and a half later, not 3 months later, not they started to build that feud. No. It was all lined up and set up, and they delivered that the next weekend. So
So heavy promos
what do
on
you
the
do for
fight.
an encore with Ngannou?
Right.
Because if it's Cyborg versus Kayla Harrison, what do you do after that? They also had Tito and Shamrock in the works already. They are ready to deliver product every single week, and this grouping here looks like they're still tied to TV channels in one entity where they're going to show their
Mm-hmm.
product. And then that one entity is going to be like, well, we're going to take a break for 6 weeks so that we can show pilots of comedies or whatever, the TV station embodies, or does. That's what you ran into in Spike. They weren't always showing UFC stuff. They moved off of Spike. That's what these
Right.
companies I don't think can do, is just go to another company as easily as the UFC proved they can do.
Right.
Contractually, they were legally able to do it,
Mm-hmm.
and you start from there. So it's like, okay,
Yeah.
Spike TV here, now we're going to go over and beyond. They did a progression. There were Fox Sports a while, and they've been on many channels. And that's
Yes.
the thing, is
Mm-hmm.
if you switch the channel next week and there's the UFC on TV every week. So Ngannou pops, they close their season, they have their Super League, and they're and here's
Right.
the other facade is they say the UFC gives about 20% of the pay-per-view revenue to the fighters, and that they're going to do 50%. Ngannou and Jones would have probably done 2 million pay-per-view sales. Ngannou against anybody under the PFL flag, unless something major is going to happen,
Mm-hmm.
which I don't see. I think that this is the major thing. They're signing of him. But whoever he fights, they're not going to get a million pay-per-view buys on that.
Four or 500K maybe.
And so you
600.
start dividing that, and it's less and less. It's the same problem that Bellator ran into with Eddie Alvarez, saying, "Yeah, we can match the UFC's contract." It's like, no, you can't. Not
Right.
at the end of the day in Eddie's bank account, and that's what we're talking about here. At the end of
Mm-hmm.
the day, they're going to be splitting a much smaller pie,
Right.
and I still think the PFL, unless they have a way to buy the Bellator League, and that way they may have a roster of 500 or 600 people, and then make sure they have weekly product no matter what. If they have a
Right. Right.
disaster, next week they have a show, following week they have a show, following week they have a show. Because if they don't, the UFC already does, and people will forget about Ngannou or whatever. No
That's
matter
right.
what
That's right.
happens, they'll forget about it in 2 weeks when
Mm-hmm.
the UFC's already bombed them with more product.
Well, they've already seen much more. And another television, or not even television, but app and way to access it for UFC that's been really beneficial is they're now on ESPN Plus, right? So yeah, they'll be on regular ESPN on cable and whatnot quite a bit, but then they also have their prelims where you just call up on your computer or your phone or whatever on that ESPN Plus, and you can watch all the prelims. And so normally, even if they have a pay-per-view through ESPN or whatnot, normally the prelims are still free. So
Yep.
then they're hyping the damn show while you're watching the prelims, and oh shoot, I didn't realize he was fighting, and oh that one, oh they've
and
got a
and
pretty
and,
good
and
one, and then you
behind the
pony
scenes
up.
realize what this takes to enact this. Okay, so they've actually divided the card into the main card, which will be the pay-per-view, and then like a headline card under it that's on prelims, and then there's the true prelims.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they deliver all three of those sections of one show on three different channels: the
You're
pay-per-view
right.
channel, and then you got to switch channels after the first four switch channels to another. What company is PFL prepared to do that?
Right.
Deliver their fights no matter what. And if they tell me, yeah, we'll stream them on our YouTube channel and this that, yeah, that's all good and bad, but it doesn't compare to what the UFC does. So they can sign Ngannou to two fights. Ngannou against Tyson Fury, Ngannou against Jones, which are the big fights out there. You can include Wilder or Joshua. Ngannou is the
Yep.
B side of all four of those fights. You've now put him under the PFL flag to be the A side, and you just won't get that bang for the buck.
I think you're right. I think you're right. Might be two and done. But the thing is, it's hard to tell where that promotion is. What's their goal with this signing, and what do they really need to happen to achieve that goal? Maybe it's not based on pay-per-view numbers for them. Maybe it's solely based on what's already happened, on the fact that people know that PFL exists. That a
Yeah.
few people. I mean, a lot of us hardcore already knew. Don't get me wrong, but a lot of people know Ngannou that probably only knew UFC, maybe Bellator occasionally.
Yeah,
Some more
if that's
casual
what they're going to pay
fans.
$20 million for, then they
That's
already
right.
got right. So
That's
they got
right.
a little bit of more name recognition. But like I said,
But is
how
it
do you
worth signing
stay?
them again? Why
How
why
do
why
you
extend it
stay
though?
in
Yeah,
in the public's eye?
that's
And
right.
that is deliver consistent product. And your competitor does that on a weekly basis. So
That's right.
how are
That's
you
right.
ready to do that?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think they're lacking, because this is the long haul. You settle in, you got Ngannou there, you bring over some other fighters, you do some interesting things like they used to do in the old days, like especially with the European aspect. Find a couple of well-established kickboxers, the Ernesto Hoost of today, and make them an offer to do MMA. And go back to do things like that. They could eventually carve out a niche for themselves. But like I said, like with Bellator will do, a few shows when a TV station puts them on the air, and they'll run up, 3-4 weeks of shows. And then there's a black hole in their, they don't even market the next shows, because I mean they may not even be sure at times.
Right. And so you brought up two deficiencies, really. I mean, Bellator is beholden to the TV station and has blackouts because of it. And PFL has the league format, which in its nature makes things a little too rigid and they finish up the tournaments and there's blackout time. So they both have holes to fill. If they join, do they take one or the other's model, or do they form a new model? I would hope to to,
If they
to be
don't,
more
if they don't
sustainable.
prepare, if they don't prepare to deliver weekly content that's readily available, as the UFC's is, and the UFC also has their Fight Pass and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And there are multiple channels around the world, you know, around the world in every spot. And that's where they may think it's like, well, we got Europe, we got this, that, and the other. Okay. But in Europe, you're prepared to show on one channel or whichever the channel is there and how they distribute. And then the following week, if that channel says, oh, we're going to show the latest, Gerard Depardieu movie, I'm in Europe,
I've been watching
then
that guy all my life.
then the guy you're not on the air, and that's
Yeah.
what you get with Viacom. Viacom doesn't have. They're the owners of Bellator. They're a TV station, and they have not made a weekly spot or told Bellator like the WWE has had, for example. That's who the UFC runs with, right? The
Right.
WWE would be like, all right, look, we need 5 hours of product to put on TV this week, which means, to get 5 hours of TV, you got to have, 30 hours of material, whatever X amount of hours of material. And, those companies are not prepared to do that. We're going to fight Ngannou. Then they're going to sit around and wait for like what? Everybody to have seen the fight and flock there. Things move too fast. By the next week, they'll be, just look what the UFC did. Ngannou made his big press release, came out, and then the UFC immediately announced their next show with a bunch of quality fights and things like that. I think it was Blachowicz versus Pereira. So 185-pound guy that beat Adesanya moving up to fight the guy that beat Adesanya moving up. So very compelling fight. They came right out and hit with the press for that fight immediately.
Mm-hmm.
It took the steam out of it.
Well, and they've got, as you mentioned, how diverse they are. They've got Tough coming out with Conor McGregor coaching against Chandler. I started this morning watching the new documentary, McGregor Forever. I'm an episode into that. That's hyping his return, and so it's been interesting to say the least. And as you talk about, what's the draw? I mean, yeah, Conor's lost a bunch. He's still the face of the UFC. Those pay-per-view sales are nuts. The fan base is nuts worldwide. And you look at boxing, the faces of, they're not necessarily guys that win every time. Canelo Alvarez, probably the face of boxing still. But is Ngannou a face of, he's the face of the PFL, but it's not the face of MMA.
I watched his own press release. I think he was talking to Ariel Helwani in one of the interviews. I watched him, but I was watching him. And I think he's a nice and likable guy that got put into a position that he didn't expect to be in. And he handled it, as best and honestly as he could. I think he's right in that, one and many people, BKFC and guys like that kind of wanted to throw out his name and get some publicity for their companies. But, he says it didn't amount to anything. With one, there's a misunderstanding, because one says, well, he wanted to be on the board. We're not going to put him on the board. It's like, no, you misunderstood. He's already on the board of PFL. He's already sitting on that offer. So either you adjust your offer or you're out of the game.
Yeah.
They were too arrogant, it seems, to realize that. Or, maybe there was a language barrier that was sufficient, but I don't think so too, because I think, Ngannou left it clear that he's got layers. He shows up and does the talking, but he's got managers and people that are dealing with that stuff. And it should be beyond a minor miscommunication like that.
It may have been the boxing issue as well. May have been a sticking point.
I think so, but that comes in where one wanted to say that they do Muay Thai, they do this, they'll do boxing. So that one isn't going to get the Tyson Fury fight, so they didn't understand what the other guy's getting at.
Right.
You effectively close him off. If PFL, I wonder if that's if PFL had said no, we need you to be exclusive, if he would have turned it down. Because I think that the boxing is still the number one biggest lucrative thing he could do. And he's never going to really want to rule it out. And would he sit out further to try to make that happen? He'd be in a very weak position to negotiate it with Fury and those guys now, if he did that. But now, where he's got something to fall back on, and maybe has a spectacular performance that lifts his stock a little bit, that fight becomes very reasonable. And what PFL I think did a good job there is, you got to remember, when Mayweather and McGregor did it, they did need the UFC's permission, and the word is that was a three-way split. And that the UFC and Dana got 9 figures out of it as well. So, whatever Mayweather got, and then whatever was left, McGregor, who we have heard got 100 million for it.
Yeah, then they get like 5 million pay-per-view around
I know. I
worldwide,
think
something like that, four or
it doesn't
five.
matter. But the thing is that Dana got and the UFC got $100 million split.
Yeah,
If the numbers that we're hearing are somewhere in that neighborhood, so the
yeah,
PFL will make money off of Ngannou doing a Tyson Fury fight by
right.
just hanging around and helping promote it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not stupid of them, I don't think.
Right.
And because I think they recognize that this guy doesn't want to box. He wants to do big fights. He doesn't want to box like, I'm going to go do 4 rounders, and come on. What is one was way off. One thinks that because, they have some numbers that indicate, because we don't really see them much in Asia, or even, I'm not sure what their extent is in Europe. I mean, outside of that, I know they're big over there, right? That's everything we hear. Their fighter development has gone very well. They've got people that understand talent, so they've got good fighters, especially at the lower weight classes and stuff.
Yep. And the
But
first fight in America, of course, just happened there in Denver and was on Prime Video. So, they're starting to make inroads that maybe PFL's not on Prime.
yeah,
Um,
I suspect that I don't know what the top level one guys make,
hmm,
but we'll see if that stays comparable to the UFC, or if it is, or if it isn't, as they come stateside.
sure,
Because
sure.
that's kind of what's up in the air. 20 million for 2 fights is 10 million a fight. You have to recognize that Ngannou would stand to make more than that in boxing.
Oh,
So that
wow. Yeah.
the pay scale and stuff is still up there. And Ngannou, I think, just wanted to be treated a certain way.
Hmm.
I think he's in a world of sharks and a bunch of lawyers and middlemen, and that at the end of the day, is probably the number one cause of deals not getting made.
Hmm. Yep. Yeah. It's not the cleanest business in the world
No,
over the
no.
years.
Yeah. Now the
Uh,
PFL has him. What are they going to do with him? Let's see who the next fight is. They say they're going to make a super fight division. So, you know, who can they possibly bring in to do that fight as a one off that would excite the world?
it's going to be fun to watch if they can really do, because you're right. They said super fight division, um, which means he fights somebody and 2 other people fight, and then his second fight is the tournament ending fight, a 3-fight tournament essentially, perhaps. So then you need 3 other stars. You ain't calling it a super fight unless they're superstars, right? So now you need 3 other stars for that scenario to have a 4-man tournament for his 2 fights. So I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, and I went through it. You can go to the PFL site and check out their 2023 heavyweight roster. And I don't see, huge names or any names that jump off the page. There are a couple of guys that come in at 5-0, like that, but there are guys there with 10 losses, veterans. Um, some of those might be interesting fights for Ngannou if you were on some type of development or long-term plan, but that's not what this guy's at the top, and he's talking about maximizing being there.
Two
So
quick fights. Yeah.
he's a very special case. 20 million, okay, so he's good. Now he gets to boxing. Now he'll be okay, and that's I think what he's looking at. He's he hasn't taken his eye off of the Tyson Fury thing, and we'll see when PFL manifests itself. Like I said, I suspect that they'll wind up owning the Bellator roster in the next, like 2024. That'll be part of what they own and stuff. And I'm not sure, you know, unless they do all the other pieces we've talked about, they're going to show, keep Bellator's name and show it on Viacom. or keep the PFLs or keep them separate, then they're still just on two channels and
Right.
distributing they have to be prepared to unite and give weekly content at the level of the UFC, or the UFC, by via of their content, will overwhelm the fans and will still be the only entity in there. And that's where one with their social media aspect, where they get it on that end, you think there might be some hope, but they got a little egg on their face on this one, because Ngannou was like, I didn't ask him to be on the board. I was already on the board at PFL. I was telling him, this is what you need to match. You asked me what you need to match. This is what you need to match. And it looks like communication problem. Silly.
Yeah, well, I guess it worked out. It gives PFL a chance to show us what they can do, honestly. And I'm not going to be mad at them if they just pick their two best guys and he fights and gets his 20 and goes on to box or something. I won't be mad about it, but there is an opportunity here that I don't think PFL should pass up, to explore ways, if you're going to use a word like super fight, to deliver on a super fight. So we'll see.
Yeah, look, it's a game of chess, and this is one move. And you've got to be thinking moves ahead, the board, how to.
Yep.
It's a very complicated game. If you think we signed Ngannou, all right, now wait, we're going to be big. That was never the approach Dana took. They were always on to the next project, on to the next project, on to the next project, on to the next project. When they get egg on their face, they throw 15 other things in front of your face so you forget about it. Nobody remembers anymore the 17-year-old kid that they rushed out of the Contender Series for Dana, and Dana put him right in, into the UFC and right into the main card. And then he got beat.
Yeah.
Nope. Moved to the side, but weekly on top of it, they've had more. Nobody remembers that. Nobody remembers their missteps. You remember the highs because they're high. You remember John Jones's last fight and stuff, but every little problem, they overwhelm you because there's more content, there's more shows.
Yep.
So
Yep.
and when the PFL announces something big, boom, they were there with an announcement that on their radar is very big too. That they announced UFC 291 and blah blah blah. So
yep. Keep rolling. Keep rolling. Yeah, it's not just better talent. It's quality and quantity, really, is what you're getting at. It's weekly. So that's and honestly, I saw a poll on that recently. Would you rather just have big shows or a show every week? It was fairly well divided, but I believe the general consensus was, bring us fights, give us something to watch every weekend, make them as good as you can, but that they don't have to be a top 10 guy every time necessarily, or
yeah,
even a title fight necessarily. So
yeah, but every fight's not going to be a box office breaker fight, and so you'll see there are people who show up for just those.
yep.
That's the fight game. The PFL is going to have maybe one shot at Ngannou creating that atmosphere, and then how are they going to stay in people's face? That's the important thing. Like I
That's
said,
right.
I go back to the example of, you have to look at it on the calendar. I think it was April 9th, Bonner and Forrest Griffin. And then April 16th, Randy Couture, Chuck Liddell 2 or something like that.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
were well prepared, already delivering weekly content, where it wasn't like, 3 weeks they're going to take a break. They still take a break every once in a while after
They
major
do.
shows and stuff like that. That's because they want to, not because they have to, not because
Right.
it's imposed on them by distribution. They
Right.
do whatever they want with distribution, and that is what you have to overcome, because
Yep.
you could watch Ngannou do whatever he does in one fight so many times, and then you're going to be looking for fresh content, something new. That's just
Yep.
today's world.
Well, and not only do they have flexibility with the different channels and whatnot, but Miguel, they have flexibility week to week. If the show's a decent show, they put it on ESPN Plus for free. If it's pay per view the very next week, it's still on ESPN Plus, as we said, for the prelims, and then boom, it's pay per view for the main. So some of these other leagues, as you said, have deals, or they struggle to keep a station going. And so they're barely able to call the shots of when they want to show on, much less whether it's going to be free or pay per view or on this channel or that channel. I mean, UFC can come at you half a dozen different ways between streaming and the 3 or 4 TV channels that they partner with. So you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a big hill to climb for one, or PFL or Bellator. Hell, they could all 3 join together. You simply don't have the structure to take over in any time within the next few years. You can start to make inroads. You can become more prevalent, but you can't take over ESPN Plus along with all the other
one of the
channels.
things, one of the things that is going to be talked about a lot is that Ngannou's on the board and that they've offered him, PFL Africa. I heard Ngannou talking. I know what one would say is one told him, sure, we'll do, we have a road to one where, we do feeder shows and we'll fund or help you fund shows in Africa or whatever. I'm sure they didn't rule out that. But, PFL Africa was, talked about as something big. That's something quite clearly here. I'm going to ask them to show me, don't tell me. I want to see. I want to see them do, a TV deal that puts them in, all the countries say in West Africa, the English speaking ones, Nigeria, Ghana, Cameroon, in that area. And these are, just more stronger. And here's the point: is the UFC had Ngannou, Adesanya, and Usman, and they didn't go there to do a show. Got to be a reason for it. And I'm going to tell you what that reason is. Very complicated. You don't just want Russia. It was the UFC didn't just dive into Russia. Now they've got the wherewithal and the knowledge to get in there. They're actually being criticized on CNN right now for having too many ties to too many Russian fighters and too many people on the sanctions list and stuff. They're still like, whoa, whoa, whoa. But they learned how to play the game in Russia, and there they are. They haven't learned to play the game in Nigeria.
Right.
And it's not, you don't just walk in there. They have their culture, they have their way of doing things. You're clearly an outsider. Things are stacked against you without getting into any of the, real life matters that could pop up. You know what I mean? It's just superficially, if the UFC, the biggest company in the world, have done shows everywhere, and they've only dealt with Russian fighters. I don't think they've actually pulled off a UFC Russia yet. If they did, maybe they got it in there once or whatever. They're not going to do it now with the war.
Right.
But, so it doesn't matter. But like I said, and I have some background dealing with Russians. What they've done getting in there with that is impressive because because it's not easy. And I think Africa is probably 10 times harder. So, at the very least, you may have to bribe your way all the way through it. And that's not there's some people that don't want to do it that way, but you can't just promise PFL Africa like it's going to be something like an iconic league in 10 years. There's so much work that goes into it that's a shot in the dark. And if Ngannou doesn't recognize it, like he's going to, he's going to be like, yeah, we're going to go to Africa and the opponents are going to make 2 million. He thinks he's going to be that. This is going to last about 18 months.
Yep. And a follow-up, UFC Fight Night, Hunt versus Oleinik was a mixed martial arts on September 15th, 2018 by the UFC at the Olympsky Stadium in Moscow, Russia. That was the first one in 2018. I think there have been a couple others since then.
Although with COVID and, COVID hit shortly after that. And then, internationally, war for a year. So I think going back there might be a tall order. Oleinik's is not exactly, the hugest draw. He's a solid fighter. I booked Oleinik, but nice. I booked Oleinik against Chael Sonnen actually. So
that's right. And you guys had a long history with Chael, I remember.
And they fought in Russia. So
Chad too.
So like I understand a little bit of how complicated those kinds of things can be. How you have to have people on your side over there, or it can just not work. And like I said, the PFL Africa is a pipe dream until I've seen it.
Right. No, and I think you're right about that. The logistics are a nightmare, and that's held true for all sorts of entertainment. Whether you look at musicians, they sometimes pull it off, but they rarely go.
It wasn't Nigeria, but the Rumble in the Jungle. Don King did it. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So
Yeah.
it's like when you people are like, well, Don King, yeah, you look at him now, and he's obviously a shadow of his former self. He hasn't even been a player in 15 years or more, but back in the day, he pulled that off, and then went to the Philippines and did there with that whole different swing of culture and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's what makes that in those moments iconic and stuff. And the UFC with three African champions had to be looking at that type of legacy thought, and they didn't step up and do it. Why do you
Right.
think that is?
Yep.
Again, it ain't easy.
It's not easy. Not easy. Well, it's a good opportunity at this point. I just want to see, because look, it's good for the sport. I don't want the UFC, even though they're the best, to be the only one. I just hope these others figure out how to, keep presenting quality stuff and keep growing. They need to grow a little bit and become more sustainable, because you're not going to sustain a company giving a guy 2 fights for 20 million and then finding another guy in a year to do it again. You're
Yeah,
going to have to have,
you got to have a plan to make your money back.
Yep.
And if their plan is yeah, pay-per-view, you know, the PFL has no history of pay-per-view. So when the UFC says you're going to get a percentage of your pay-per-view, here is the way that breaks down. If you're on the undercard, you don't get a percentage. If you're on the pay-per-view and you're the first fight, you get X amount. You're the main event, you get this amount plus $1 or whatever per pay-per-view sales from this range to this range and stuff like that. And they've got hard numbers that they can say this is the neighborhood of what you're going to make. The PFL says we're going to do a pay-per-view. Okay, that's good. Most companies, I've done pay-per-views with a company that we had good funding, and the first pay-per-view sold probably 15,000 pay-per-views, headlining with a Gracie. So it's not the UFC's name behind their pay-per-view sells is
Right.
a sales point. Most people will see that something else as what's that, another league. They may be curious, but they could also forget about.
Well, these are people you spend time with every week. Now, I don't mean every individual fighter, but you're Daniel Cormier in the ring interviewing people. You're Joe Rogan, you're Ariel Helwani. These guys that are ringside and presenting, and even what is it? Bruce Buffer. Did I get the Buffers mixed up?
Bruce is the UFC guy, yeah.
Okay, yeah. The US, it's time. I mean, even those things become candy to your brain. You're used to hearing it. You're used to hearing and seeing it. You're used to seeing the logo, and
Yeah.
so it's a familiar, it's your cheers of the combat world, if you will, because you've become used to it. You're a regular. And so then you turn on PFL or ONE FC, the simple fact that the lighting is different. They may use different camera, different angles. Some guys talking you never heard of,
And let me step in and give you another, you talk about Rogan and the UFC, Dana himself being the front guy. You don't see, the depth of executives and things like that. On the PFL's end, they do investments and rounds of investors and stuff, and they love to toss names around. I look, I'm 52 years old. I'm not, you know, the expert on modern culture and stuff, but there's a rapper named Wiz Khalifa.
Sure.
Okay. So
Yeah,
he's
yeah.
one of the investors. Who else is one of the investors? Alex Rodriguez, the former Yankee great.
Yankee, New York Yankee.
Um, there's several football players that are involved in that. It's like we're the fight people. Because Ray Sefo was there, and I think Ray was bought along from when they were the World Series of Fighting, and that he's now on the board there. But he's a European kickboxer. These guys are doing MMA. You're counting on, people will recognize his name and talk to him and stuff like that. But do you have, a core of fight people? Like, are your announcers good? And, like you're talking about depth and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Ray Sefo, I think, is the only person that comes from the fight game that's there. Other than that, it's like football players on the board, Alex Rodriguez on the board. And that's a good example of what I think, putting somebody on the board means. It really is just a little bit of publicity. Does the board come with a salary for Ngannou? Is he given $100,000 a month for board expenses if he has to be in Africa to go put? No, they're all commemorative. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so in Alex Rodriguez's case, I'm sure that he ponied up more money than me and you have just for them to test out on this league.
Right,
So
right.
therefore they throw his name around and stuff like that. But I don't think those
Mm-hmm.
are, that's not Dana with his sleeves rolled up, working every single minute of the day to make this bigger. I think you've got a lot of people there that, have roles that they're,
Mm-hmm.
making up for people, and spokespersons here and Wiz Khalifa here. And, you know, Wiz Khalifa is not talking about the PFL every day of his life, it's a side thing for them. And
Yeah.
that's where I don't like that aspect of it, because it looks like they're reaching.
Mm-hmm.
It's like
Mm-hmm.
Alex Rodriguez aboard. It's like, okay, is he really aboard? Does he love the sport? Is he training? Does he have guys that he wants to help? Bring along? Is he starting a fight team? Is he doing any of that stuff, or is he off being
Right.
Alex Rodriguez? I think
Right.
it's more of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
and I think the UFC has nurtured that atmosphere around them. So yeah, they're way behind on everything. The
They
PFL.
really are. All three leagues are. I think the three leagues have varying strengths. When I say all three, the three that aren't UFC, one FC, Bellator, and PFL, they all have different challenges, but they're all, um, you know, distant to the UFC. UFC is clearly the front runner, and those guys are, you could argue, tied for fourth.
Yeah,
Something to that
yeah.
effect.
To me, one is the most compelling because of their rule base and their kind of
I do love it.
their high level martial art
Mm-hmm.
philosophy. I don't think the PFL quite shares that. I don't think Bellator shares that. Um,
And one broke into prime. So I'm with you. We can
but
we
if
can
if
move
the
one
if
into
the
second place. But
if one were to be able to be part of that, if PFL is the name they use, but they use the one rules now that they've been accepted by Denver and Colorado and stuff, there's an outside chance that they can create something different and more
mm-hmm.
compelling. But like I said, you can't, even in the case of one, it's like, yeah, we'll be back in Atlanta in September. It's like, okay, do you know what the UFC will do
Between now and
in
September.
September?
Right.
If I'm going to throw out, they'll probably have more than 150 fights, not fight shows, but 150 fights, which means 10 to 12 shows.
Right. Yeah.
You're not competing with them.
No. 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 No, we can't expect that anytime soon, but we can enjoy what they give us and hope that it's sustainable enough to stick around and provide, a little competition. There are issues with fighter pay that can be addressed by having competition. So I'm all for that, for these guys getting paid to get in there and get the hell beat out of them. So,
Yep, and
um,
just to wrap it up, because we've been going long, but just one, and maybe PFL, Bellator, there's a real chance that the hardcore fans, the people that are watching this stuff, could catch a sports book that is behind and doesn't know enough.
mm,
And here's an opportunity as you get to know PFL's roster. Maybe there are a couple of killers on there, but you got to judge that for yourself. Get in there and check. But if you do your homework, here's a whole new body of work where if you could stay ahead of the sport books until they get to know it, or until they know
mhm.
everybody in the PFL and they can make calls inside and this, that, and the other stuff. All that stuff is nascent. So these guys pop up at the sport books. It may be worth your time to take a look.
It may well be. May well be. Good call on that. Obviously, some wide swings that could be happening. And then a lot of times too, when the bookie sets the line, if money's coming in on one guy, it's going to change that number, of course. So not only do the bookies may not have all the information, but there may be a guy with the last name. Look at was it Cron Gracie last week? So money's coming in on Gracie. It looked like the guy was a high school wrestler fighting pros. I mean,
Yeah.
so it may be in the PFL, where there's a name. So you and I love to look at opening lines versus current lines. And in a league like that, where not only do the books not fully informed, but the bettors, then we may be able to find some real gems where people have been putting the money on the wrong guy, like when you called Pavlich just a few weeks ago.
And that's one that you could see Pavlich coming. But for example, in Ngannou, and I'm just making this up, but let's say, for example, they announce we're doing a PFL super fight. Ngannou's first opponent is going to be making his MMA debut, and it's Gordon Ryan, the grappling Abu Dhabi champion, guy like that, who probably needs to work a little bit of striking to get his takedown in and get you down, and then on the ground, he'll probably finish anybody in the world, right? If that were the case, it wouldn't surprise me that Ngannou would open a minus 1,000. And just go back to the old days. You have here for the 21st century what a modern version of grappler versus striker is. Mm-hmm. And remember, this grapplers have an advantage, man. Mm-hmm. So if they mess up and Ngannou, even he's old now, and so Ngannou's not that young. Even we talked about Alexei Olenek, someone like Olenek with his skill base, he would want Ngannou on the ground. Should he get him on the ground? Should he be on top? Now we're in a dangerous situation. Mm-hmm. At least he's winning the round, and then he may be able to pull off a submission in something that Ngannou's not that versed in.
If you can get him at a plus 800 or something, hey.
But that's what's going to happen is Ngannou's going to come in with, unless it's the Tyson Fury fight next, mm-hmm. but against just about anybody, he's going to come in with a huge bump in name recognition and name value that mm-hmm. may not be warranted. So we'll see.
Well, and let's not forget, he's got 3 losses. He's not invincible. He's lost 3 times.
He's lost. And I think that he's not a total package MMA fighter.
Right.
He's got what he's very good at, which is obviously the big strike, be physical, hard to take down, dominate, and that sort of stuff. But mm-hmm. it's going to be interesting to see, because I remember that same description fits for Brock Lesnar.
Right.
And if you remember Brock, what happened when Brock looked up and he still saw Alistair Overeem still there after, he got off his little rush or whatever. And that's what's going to happen with Ngannou, is when he faces somebody who's going to be in his face. Like,
that's right.
He hasn't yet. Stipe didn't, but he's, Stipe is one of the guys that's in the neighborhood, so we'll see. Right. But yeah, and so Ngannou's with the PFL. That's the big news, right?
It is. It'll be fun to watch, see what happens. Can they make something of the opportunity?